My name is Travis, and for the past 9 years, I've worked as a cemetery operations supervisor in Asheville, North Carolina. It's not the kind of job most people think about until they need it, and even then, they don't really want to know the details of what we do. I manage ground maintenance, coordinate burials, handle administrative work, and occasionally, I oversee exhumations. Exhumations are rare, maybe 3 or 4 a year at our cemetery. Usually they're straightforward legal matters. A family wants to move a loved one to a different plot, or there's an insurance dispute that requires examination of remains, or law enforcement needs evidence for a cold case. The process is heavily regulated, requires multiple permits, and involves coordination between funeral homes, medical examiners, and sometimes lawyers. It's somber work, but it's generally routine. What I'm about to tell you about happened last November, and it was anything but routine. I've been trying to make sense of it for months now, replaying every detail in my mind, looking for some explanation that doesn't terrify me. I haven't found one. Mountain View Cemetery, where I work, was established in 1889. It's one of the older cemeteries in the region, sprawling across about 60 acres of hillside terrain with sections that date back to different eras. The oldest graves are near the original entrance, with headstones so weathered by mountain weather that many are illegible now. Some plots have been there so long that the families who purchased them are extinct, no living relatives to maintain them or even remember who's buried there. The exhumation request came through official channels in late October. A law firm in Charlotte had contacted us on behalf of a client who needed to relocate their great-grandfather's remains from Mountain View to a family plot in Virginia. The deceased was a man named Silas Merchant, buried in 1952 in Section F, one of our mid-century areas. The paperwork was in order, all the necessary permits had been obtained, and the family had hired Riverside Funeral Services to handle the technical aspects of the disinterment and reburial. I'd worked with Riverside before. They're professional, experienced with exhumations, and their director, a man named Harold Whitmore, had been in the funeral business for over 30 years. Harold called me personally to coordinate the logistics, and we scheduled the exhumation for November 14th, a Thursday morning. Exhumations are always done early, before the cemetery opens to visitors, both for privacy and to avoid disturbing people who might be visiting other graves. The forecast called for clear weather, cold but dry, which was good. Exhumations in rain or snow are miserable for everyone involved. I arrived at the cemetery at 5:30 a.m., well before sunrise, to meet the crew and get everything set up. My assistant groundskeeper, a guy named Russell who'd been with us for about 3 years, was already there with the excavation equipment. Harold arrived at 6 a.m. sharp with 2 of his employees, both experienced funeral technicians. The medical examiner's office had sent an observer, a younger woman named Dr. Keiko Yoshida, who was there to document the condition of the remains for the legal transfer. There was also an attorney present, representing the family's interests, though he mostly stood at a distance and observed without saying much. We gathered near the grave site as the sun began to rise over the mountains. Section F is on a slope, and Silas Merchant's plot was about halfway up the hill, surrounded by graves from the same era. His headstone was simple, gray granite with his name, birth year of 1889, death year of 1952, and a brief inscription, "Rest in peace." No flowers, no decorations. According to our records, no one had visited the grave in at least 15 years. The process of exhumation is methodical and careful. You can't just dig up a grave like you're planting a garden. First, we removed the sod covering the plot, rolling it back in sections so it could be replaced later. Then Russell operated the small excavator, removing dirt layer by layer while Harold and I watched to make sure we didn't damage anything. Modern graves have concrete burial vaults, but graves from 1952 predated that requirement in our county. Silas Merchant had been buried in just a casket directly in the earth, which meant we had to be especially careful. It took about 45 minutes to dig down to the depth where the casket should be. The earth was dense, packed by decades of weight and weather. Russell worked slowly, and Harold kept checking the depth with a probe rod, a long metal stick we used to locate caskets without damaging them. When the probe struck something solid at about 5.5 feet, we knew we'd found it. Russell climbed out of the excavator, and he and I got into the grave with shovels to do the final clearing by hand. This is always the delicate part. You're working in a confined space, trying to expose the casket without scratching or denting it, clearing dirt from around the edges so straps can be positioned for lifting. The first thing I noticed was that the casket wasn't level. One end had settled deeper than the other, tilted at an angle of maybe 15 degrees. This happens sometimes when the ground shifts over decades, but it made our job harder. We'd have to be extra careful lifting it to prevent any remaining structural integrity from failing and the whole thing collapsing. As we cleared more dirt, I got my first good look at the casket itself. It was a metal casket, probably steel, which was common in that era. The exterior was heavily corroded, rust eating through the finish in patches, but overall it seemed structurally intact. The handles were still attached, though badly oxidized. Harold climbed down into the grave with us to assess the condition and determine the best way to lift it. "We'll need to use the straps under the casket," he said, brushing dirt off the surface. "The handles won't support the weight anymore. Travis, let's clear underneath so we can slide the straps through." Russell brought the lifting straps down, heavy nylon webbing rated for several £100. We worked to dig channels under the casket so we could thread the straps through. This required getting our hands into the tight space between the casket and the walls of the grave, scooping out packed earth in the near darkness at the bottom of the hole. I was working on the left side when my hand brushed against something that made me pause. The side of the casket felt different there, not smooth like corroded metal should be. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it at the spot. There were grooves in the metal, deep parallel scratches, 4 of them, running vertically down the side of the casket. They were too regular, too deliberate to be random corrosion or damage from shifting earth. They looked exactly like they'd been made by fingernails dragging down metal. "Harold," I called up, "you should see this." He climbed back down and I showed him the scratches. His expression changed immediately, the professional composure faltering for just a moment. He ran his finger along the grooves, feeling their depth. "Could be from the original burial," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes the pallbearer's tools slip during lowering and scratch the casket." I didn't argue, but I'd been present at dozens of burials over the years, and I'd never seen scratches like these from lowering equipment. These were different. These were frantic. We continued working, threading the straps underneath, and as we did, I found more scratches. They were on both sides of the casket, concentrated near what would be the upper half where the head and chest would be. Some were shallow, others deep enough that the metal had bent slightly inward from the pressure. Russell noticed them too. "What the hell happened to this thing?" he muttered, but nobody answered. We got the straps positioned and climbed out of the grave. Harold's crew attached the straps to a mechanical lifting frame they'd brought, essentially a tripod with a motorized winch. Slowly, carefully, the casket began to rise from the earth. As it emerged into daylight, we could see the full extent of the damage. The entire top half of the casket was covered in scratches. Some were orderly, parallel lines like the ones I'd first noticed. Others were chaotic, overlapping, gouges that crisscrossed each other in what looked like pure panic. The pattern was undeniable. Someone, or something, had clawed at this casket from the inside. Dr. Yashida stepped forward, her camera already out, documenting everything. "This is highly unusual," she said, which struck me as an understatement. She took dozens of photos from every angle, the camera flash reflecting off the rusted metal. The attorney was on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones to whoever was on the other end. Harold stood very still, staring at the casket with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been concern. It might have been fear. "We need to open it," Dr. Yashida said. "Before we transport, I need to verify the identity and condition of the remains. That's protocol for any exhumation. but given what we're seeing here, it's especially important." Harold nodded and retrieved his tools. Opening a casket that's been sealed for decades is not simple. The seals have usually corroded, but they can still be stubborn. Harold worked at the seal line with a specialized pry bar, working his way around the perimeter. I could hear the metal groaning as he applied pressure. With a sudden crack, the seal broke. A rush of air escaped from inside, not the overwhelming stench you might expect, just a musty, earthy smell. Harold paused, then slowly lifted the lid. I will never forget what we saw inside. Silas Merchant's casket interior, which would have originally been lined with white or cream-colored fabric, was destroyed. The fabric was shredded completely, torn away in long strips that hung from the lid and sides. The padding underneath was exposed, compressed, and stained dark brown in places. But it was the lid that made my stomach turn. The underside of the casket lid was covered in scratches, far worse than the exterior. Deep gouges had torn through the fabric and into the metal underneath. In some places, the scratches were so deep they'd created small holes, puncturing through the steel. The pattern was unmistakable and horrifying, the desperate scraping of fingernails against unyielding metal. The remains were in poor condition, as you'd expect after 70 years, but certain things were immediately apparent. The skeleton was face down. The body had clearly turned over at some point, lying prone in the casket, rather than in the peaceful supine position used for burial. The skull was turned to the side, jaw open as if frozen mid-scream. Dr. Yashida leaned in with her camera, professional despite the disturbing scene. She documented everything methodically, taking photos and notes. Harold and his crew stood back, and I noticed one of them, a young guy probably in his 20s, had gone pale and was looking away. "The position of the remains is inconsistent with standard burial preparation," Dr. Yashida said, speaking into a small recorder. "The body appears to have moved post-burial. Significant trauma visible to the hands." She pointed, and I forced myself to look. The skeletal hands were positioned above the head, arms bent at the elbows. The finger bones were damaged, several of them broken or fragmented. The fingertips, or what remained of them, showed signs of severe trauma. Russell had backed away from the grave site and was sitting on a nearby headstone, his head in his hands. The attorney was still on his phone, his voice rising slightly as he spoke to someone about unexpected complications and needing legal guidance immediately. Harold closed the lid carefully, his hands shaking slightly. He'd been in the funeral business for 3 decades, had seen everything you could imagine, and he was shaken. "I need to make some calls," he said quietly. "This isn't just an exhumation anymore. This is a potential investigation." Dr. Yashida agreed. "I'm required to report this to the medical examiner's office." The condition of the remains and the evidence of trauma raises questions about the circumstances of death and burial. Over the next hour, our quiet morning exhumation turned into something much larger. The county medical examiner arrived, a stern older man named Dr. Eugene Foster, who'd held the position for 20 years. 2 sheriff's deputies showed up, though Harold assured them this was almost certainly a historical matter, not an active crime scene. Dr. Foster examined the casket and remains personally, taking his own photographs and samples. When he finally stood up, he looked tired. "I've seen this before," he said, "though never this severe. We're looking at what appears to be premature burial. The deceased was likely buried alive, regained consciousness in the casket, and the trauma we're seeing is from his attempts to escape." The words hung in the air like a weight, buried alive. One of humanity's most primal fears, and we were staring at the evidence that it had actually happened to Silas Merchant in 1952. "How is that possible?" the attorney asked. "There are protocols, examinations. How could someone be buried alive?" Dr. Foster shook his head. In 1952, medical technology was different. Death verification was less sophisticated. If someone appeared to be dead, no pulse, no respiration, cool to the touch, They could be pronounced dead when they were actually in a deep coma or a cataleptic state. It's rare, but it happens. There are documented cases throughout history. I thought about Silas Merchant, waking up in absolute darkness, sealed in a box underground. The panic, the terror, the desperate clawing at the lid. The scratches told a story of horror that I couldn't comprehend. How long had he been conscious? Minutes? Hours? How long did it take for the oxygen to run out? "What happens now?" Harold asked. Dr. Foster explained that he would need to take the remains for a complete forensic examination. The family would be notified of the findings. There would likely be an amended death certificate. As for the exhumation and reburial, that would proceed, but only after the investigation was complete. The casket was loaded into Dr. Foster's transport vehicle, and the crew began the somber task of filling in the grave we'd just opened. I stayed until everything was cleaned up, the sod replaced, the equipment stored. Russell left early, saying he didn't feel well. I couldn't blame him. That evening, I went home and did something I rarely do. I started researching premature burial, looking for any information I could find about Silas Merchant and similar cases. What I discovered made everything worse. Premature burial, also called vivisepulture, was a legitimate medical concern throughout history. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was such a widespread fear that people invented safety coffins, elaborate devices with bells, breathing tubes, and flags that could be triggered from inside the casket if someone woke up. Some people wrote clauses into their wills demanding they be kept above ground for days before burial, or that their doctors sever major arteries to ensure death before interment. By the 1950s, those fears had largely faded. Modern medicine had better methods for confirming death, and premature burial was considered a thing of the past. But clearly, it still happened. Silas Merchant was proof. I found his obituary in the newspaper archives, dated March 1952. It said he died suddenly of a heart attack at age 63, survived by a wife and 2 children. The funeral had been held at Morrison Brothers Funeral Home, followed by burial at Mountain View Cemetery. Nothing unusual, nothing to suggest the horror that had occurred. Had anyone suspected? Had his family heard anything at the funeral? The thought made me sick. If the burial had been on a Saturday and he'd regained consciousness that night, he could have been scratching and screaming while families visited other graves on Sunday, completely unaware that someone was dying in agony beneath their feet. Dr. Foster's full report came back 3 weeks later. I wasn't officially entitled to see it, but Harold shared the relevant parts with me. The forensic examination confirmed that Silas Merchant had indeed been conscious in the casket. The trauma to his hands was consistent with repeated impact against a hard surface. Several finger bones were fractured in ways that indicated sustained, desperate action. Splinters of wood and metal fragments were found embedded in the bone, material from the casket interior that had broken off as he clawed at it. Most disturbing was the estimate of how long he'd survived. Based on the extent of the damage and the pattern of trauma, Dr. Foster estimated that Silas had been conscious and actively trying to escape for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours before either asphyxiating or dying from the stress and shock. 2 hours. Imagine 2 hours of that nightmare, alone in the dark, running out of air, your fingernails tearing off as you scratch uselessly at metal and wood, knowing you're going to die and no one can hear you. The family was informed of the findings and issued a statement through their attorney expressing shock and grief at the circumstances of their great-grandfather's death. They declined to comment further and proceeded with the reburial in Virginia. I don't know if they opened the casket for a viewing, but I can't imagine they did. The story never made it to the news. The family wanted privacy, and since this was a historical case with no living suspects or witnesses, there was no public interest angle to pursue. As far as I know, only the people directly involved in the exhumation know what we found. But I can't stop thinking about it. I've been supervising cemetery operations for 9 years. How many other graves at Mountain View hold similar secrets? How many of those weathered headstones from the 1800s and early 1900s mark graves where someone woke up too late, trapped in their own coffin? The fear of premature burial was so prevalent in Victorian times because it happened often enough that people knew it was a real risk. Medical science has improved dramatically since then, but it still happens. I've researched modern cases, and they're rare, but not non-existent. People who were pronounced dead who woke up in morgues, in funeral homes, even in caskets before burial. We like to think we've solved this problem, but Silas Merchant proved we haven't. I started having nightmares about a month after the exhumation. I dream that I'm in a casket, waking up in darkness, realizing where I am. I can feel the satin lining under my fingers, and I start to push against the lid, but it doesn't move. I scratch and claw and scream, but no sound escapes. The air gets thinner, and I know I'm going to die, and no one will ever know I was conscious when they buried me. I wake up gasping, my heart racing, and I can't get back to sleep. My wife is worried about me. She thinks I should talk to someone, maybe a therapist. I probably should, but how do I explain this? How do I make someone understand what it's like to see physical evidence that one of our worst nightmares is real? Russell quit about 6 weeks after the exhumation. He told me he couldn't work in the cemetery anymore, that he kept thinking about what we'd found every time he walked past a grave. He got a job doing landscaping for a golf course, and I don't blame him for leaving. Harold Whitmore retired earlier this year, about 4 months after the Merchant exhumation. He'd been planning to retire anyway, he said, but I think what we saw accelerated his timeline. He told me during his farewell lunch that in 30 years in the funeral business, the Merchant case was the worst thing he'd ever encountered. He'd seen decomposition, violent deaths, suicides, every kind of tragedy. But the evidence of someone dying in slow terror, trapped and alone, that was different. That was a special kind of horror. Dr. Yashida sent me an email a few weeks ago asking if I'd be willing to speak at a forensic pathology conference about the case. She's presenting a paper on premature burial in the modern era, and she thought my perspective as someone who witnessed the exhumation would be valuable. I declined. I don't want to talk about it publicly, don't want to relive those details in front of an audience, but I appreciated that she asked. The grave site where Silas Merchant was buried has been filled in, the sod replaced, and you'd never know anything unusual had happened there. There's an empty plot now in Section F, waiting for whoever purchases it next. I walk past it sometimes during my rounds, and I always pause and think about what came out of that ground. I've made some changes to how we handle things at Mountain View. Nothing official, nothing I've written into policy, but personal practices I follow now. When we have a burial, I make sure I'm present, and I pay attention to the deceased in the casket. I look for any signs of life, any tiny indication that something might be wrong. I know it's irrational, that modern embalming makes premature burial essentially impossible, but I can't help it. I need to be sure. I've also started documenting the old graves more thoroughly. I've been creating a database of every burial at Mountain View before 1960, noting the cause of death if I can find it, the date of burial, any unusual circumstances. I'm looking for patterns, though I don't know what I expect to find. More cases like Silas Merchant. I hope not, but if they're there, I want to know. Sometimes I wonder about the people who buried him in 1952. The funeral director, the groundskeepers, the pallbearers. Did any of them suspect something was wrong? Did anyone hear scratching sounds while they shoveled dirt onto the casket? Or did they all go home that evening, satisfied they'd performed their duties properly, never knowing the horror they'd left behind? The worst part is knowing that this will happen again. Not at Mountain View necessarily, and probably not in my lifetime, but somewhere, someday, someone will be pronounced dead who isn't. They'll be prepared for burial, sealed in a casket, and buried, and they'll wake up. And they'll experience the same terror that Silas Merchant experienced. And decades or centuries later, someone will exhume them and find the same evidence we found. The scratches, the turned body, the broken fingers. It's an inevitable consequence of our mortality, and the imperfection of our ability to verify death. As long as we bury people, this risk exists. We've minimized it, certainly. Modern medical technology is incredibly sophisticated, but we haven't eliminated it, and I don't think we ever will. I still work at Mountain View Cemetery. I still coordinate exhumations when they're necessary. But every time we open a grave, every time we lift a casket from the earth, I'm looking for those scratches, checking the interior for signs of disturbance, hoping I never find them again. Because if I do find them, it means another person died the way Silas Merchant died, awake and terrified and alone in the dark, knowing they were buried alive and that no one was coming to save them. That's the knowledge I carry now, the weight I feel every day I go to work. I walk among graves that might hold similar secrets, and I wonder how many stories of horror are buried beneath Mountain View's peaceful hills. How many people scratched at their coffin lids until their fingers broke? How many called out for help that never came? I'll never know. Most of those graves will never be disturbed. The dead will keep their secrets forever. But I know they're there. I know that underneath the carefully maintained grounds, beneath the flowers and headstones and peaceful facade, there are stories of terror that would horrify anyone who learned them. That's what I witnessed last November during what should have been a routine exhumation. I saw proof that our nightmares are real, that sometimes the horror stories we tell ourselves aren't fiction. They're history, and they're waiting, buried in the earth, for someone to dig deep enough to uncover them. 2 weeks after Harold retired, I pulled the Section F ledger from the archive room, a metal cabinet that still smells faintly of oil and carbon paper. Tucked between burial permits and plot sketches was a thin envelope marked Merchant Maintenance. Inside, there was a faded Polaroid of the grave taken in 1976 after a storm washout, and a handwritten note from a former superintendent, Ellis Grant. Minor subsidence, repacked, family not reachable. On the back of the photo, a grease pencil arrow pointed to a hairline depression exactly where we'd found the casket tilted. I ran my thumb over the gloss, feeling the ridge of dried grease. The ground had been telling this story for decades. We just hadn't known the language. I started walking Section F at daybreak, before the crews arrived. The dew there hangs low and cold, and you can hear the road a mile off like a far river. I'd stop at the empty rectangle where Silas had lain and listen, not for knocks, not for anything supernatural, just for the place breathing. Birds, the clack of a far gate, the muffled thud of a squirrel bounding over turf. You learn the honest sounds of a cemetery. Dishonest sounds have edges. One morning, an elderly man in a veteran's cap stood at the fence line, fingers through the chain links. He introduced himself as Owen, said he'd put in 30 years on grave crews, back when the dirt was heavier and the rules were lighter. I asked if he'd ever opened a casket that didn't look like it should. He didn't answer right away. He stared past me, upslope. In '78, he said finally, we moved a husband to be beside his wife. When we lifted him out, the lid had a dent from the inside, not much, like a heel had pressed once and quit. Boss told us lids buckle sometimes. I let him tell it. He tapped the fence twice, the way you test a post. If you listen out here long enough, you'll hear what you're afraid to hear. The job is deciding what you can live with. I went home that night and wrote an actual protocol, not just habits. A 15-minute stillness after the lowering device is removed. A second person assigned to auditory watch, not shoveling. Documentation of any unusual soil acoustics. A contact tree that includes the funeral director, the ME's office, and me, with explicit stop work authority for any crew member. I printed it and slid a copy into Howard's inbox, not as a demand, just a paper that would exist if something ever needed to exist fast. Last week we had a routine disinterment for a floodplain relocation. Nothing dramatic, a modern vault from 2004. When the crane took the weight, I felt the straps sing. That taut wine steel makes under load, and for a heartbeat, I was back at Silas's grave watching rust peel like paint. The lid came up clean. No scratches. The interior was the quiet of a sealed decade. The family cried the ordinary kind of tears. We set the vault in the new ground, and I held the 15 minutes like a vigil, counting each second into my pocket. When the timer ended, I gave the nod. Russell's replacement, young kid named Mateo, asked why we wait when the vaults are airtight. I told him the truth without telling him the story, because silence deserves its measurements. He grinned like he thought I was being poetic. Maybe I was. Or maybe I've learned that procedures are just how we build courage we can use. That evening, a storm rolled over the hills, and the cemetery took the rain like a confession. Water beaded on granite, pooled in lettering, traced names I hadn't read in years. From my truck, I watched Section F darken to a single tone. Somewhere under that slope, there are more envelopes in more cabinets, more arrows drawn in grease pencil, more dents explained away. I can't exhume the past for all of them. I can only be here now, with a clock, with a rule, with a willingness to stop the machine the instant the earth says, in whatever language it chooses, that someone still needs to be heard.